because people at your age knows about it. So shall we start with, say, Charlie Houston, who was your good friend?
Well, Charlie was a good friend. Of course, Charlie was a legend already when I was starting to climb. And I had met Charlie a couple of times at the American Alpine Club meetings and dinners. And when I got the idea for the Hidden Peak trip, I wrote Charlie a letter. I had a letterhead already printed up. And I sent Charlie a letter asking him, saying that the expedition consists of me and my typewriter. And apparently, he had sort of done the same thing himself, as I realized later. So I got this very encouraging note from him, not saying you should get more experience or what you the usual things. He just gave me a lot of good advice. And it was extremely helpful. And came back, and I've got to know Charlie quite well. Of course, I got to know all those people, Charlie, Bob Bates, Brad Washburn. And they were just a remarkable bunch of people. And
but did you go out climbing with them anyway?
The only person I went on a trip with was Bob Bates. We worked together on the Ulag Mustag trip for about 8 years. And Bob was one of the nicest men I've ever known in my life. Everyone loved Bob Bates. He never had a bad word. He never said a bad word about anything. Don't ask me how he did it. And it was, I can remember, you know how it is. We were going into some government office, one after another, total rejection. And we'd come out, and with Bob, we start laughing and pull ourselves together and go back in somewhere else again. And the trip itself, it was an absolute delight. He knew all these old vaudeville songs, which he sang all the way into the mountain as we were driving along. And I just absolutely loved being with the guy. And so he was a real inspiration. In fact, after he died, I spoke at his memorial service. He died a couple of years ago. And I took a picture of him, which he liked and used. And Betsy went down and had it specially made, computerized, framed, and underneath it was, what would Bob smiling, what would Bob Bates do? And we put this up, it's up on the sideboard in our dining area. But he's just one, and there's just a bunch of them. What I found was...
Bradford Washburn?
Brad, what I found was, Harish, that almost all of these famous climbers...
I mean, they formed a trilogy. 3 of them. Yes.
The 3 of them.
Yes. So.
Well, all of them, when you just got to know them a little, and you're a climber, so you share the same enthusiasm. They're very friendly. They're very helpful. And they all had remarkable stories.
What, for example?
Well, the most remarkable story, one of the most remarkable ones, became a book by Dave Roberts called Escape from Lucania. When Bob Bates and Brad Washburn were landed behind this mountain range, and the plane that flew them in, this is I think 1938 or so, got stuck. And the pilot realized, they finally got into the air, but the pilot realized he could not come back and pick anybody up and take off with extra weight. So here the 2 of them are, flown in behind this mountain range, and the only way out was up over the range and down the other side and out to a road. And that's an extraordinary story. And I just loved hearing this story. And then, of course, it later became a book and available to everyone. But that's the sort of type of stories you got from these people. And you're just really impressed with the character of people like Charlie and...
But they used to come and stay with you sometimes?
Yeah. Charlie, I don't think Charlie ever stayed with us, but Bob and Gail certainly did quite a few times, and Brad Washburn did. But, what would happen is, if you were living in an area, your house became sort of the base for everyone drift. You would stay with friends when you traveled, and they would stay with you when they came. So pretty soon, all these mountaineers back in, there weren't that, would just come in, and you were the place where they stopped at. And as a result, you got to know quite a few people, and you'd become friends, and you really get to see the human side of them. And it was
What Washburn supposed to be very temperamental, very outspoken?
Yes, Brad is. And in fact, that was one of the advantages of Bob. Bob could go with Brad because he did not respond. And Bob would just smile and go on. So Brad never went on a trip, I think this is true, where someone else was the leader. In other words, it was his show, but Brad was always very helpful, and but right, he was more temperamental. Put it this way, you didn't have to watch yourself when you're around Bob Bates. You just be yourself. But with Brad, you just sort of be a little careful, shall we say, in what you do and say. You know what you understand what I'm saying. But I was very fond of him. And all these people were very, very interesting. And again, I can't emphasize amazingly to me how friendly they were, and they're sharing their enthusiasm for the mountains, and you get them telling their stories. And you got some very interesting stories from some of these people. I mean, it's quite.
Okay, now what about your good friend, Tom?
Oh, Tom! Good heavens!
Thomas Hornbein.
Tom and I go back. We were.
Where did you first meet him?
In summer camp in a place called Chile Camps near Estes Park in Rocky Mountain National Park. And that's where I picked up the bug for climbing, and that's where Tom picked up the bug for climbing. And he had been over another part of the camp, and then finally my last year there, Tom came over to the main camp. We were both junior counselors together, so we did a lot of hikes and backpacks, and we stayed in touch. And he went to the University of Colorado. I went to school in California. But then later we got together and I came through and we did a climb. I kid him. He had a couple of beginners, new climbers with him, and he wanted to climb this pinnacle. He tried it once before. He needed me. I go up. He brings me up to him. He's just before the summit. There's this overhang. In those days, we used what we call combined tactics. You climbed over each other. So I went up and he just tied me in, anchored me in. He goes up and finally I shove him up over the top of this thing. He dances on my head trying to get a piton in. He gets in and he says, "Do you mind us staying there?" So the others could come up too. So I did. So I became a part of the mountain, and the other two guys come stomping all over me. They get up, and just then, of course, in Colorado, about 3 p.m, here comes the thunderstorm coming. And there's this pinnacle, so you want to get the devil out of there. So I said, "Hey, Nick, you don't really want to come up, do you? I'll just sign your name in the register." So I always kid him about that. I said, "Never mind, let's just get out of here." But and so we all joked about that. But then, and he couldn't go on Hidden Peak. The time came for the Masherbrum trip.
He did not come to Hidden Peak with you?
No, because we just tried to get who I could get. I needed people who could say they could, go, who were reasonably good. And they also had to be good enough and nice enough that if we got the permission, you'd be glad to have them in a party. You just couldn't get anybody's name and stick it on a list. And but Tom couldn't. On Masherbrum, he could. And so he was on the Masherbrum trip and, of course, did extremely well. He had to reach the summit, but he was the doctor and had to go down with McCormick. And if you're running on electricity, okay. So and then we went to Paiute together, and then we went into Ulag Mustag in '85 together. That's where he first met Pete Schoening. And Tom had really not known Pete before that, and they became extremely close friends from that trip. And after that, we did several trips together in Yunnan. So I figured I've done 5 trips with Tom, and for a while there, Pete and Tom and I were extremely close. And Pete's gone now, and I consider Tom my closest friend. And we kid each other all the time. We give each other a hard time. You know how it is. You've known each other for 50 years.
You were not involved or close with Peter Schoening about Everest, K2 and all other aspects?
With whom?
With your Pete.
Pete Schoening?
Yes.
Well, I was very close to Pete.
What was his views about K2?
That's right. Pete became well known and famous for having held 5 falling men on K2. They were sliding, but still it's 5 falling men, plus the weight of Art Gilkey on that stretcher. And interestingly about Pete, again, at that time, American mountaineering was we all sort of knew or heard of each other. You couldn't do it now, but then you could. And we could sit in a small room, or the group of us are going, and we could discuss just about any climber in the country that we thought be qualified, that we'd want on this trip. I mean, that's how small the group was. And as I said, not only do we know what he had done, we even know if he snored at night. I mean, that's everybody's reputation. It was really a small village is what it was, but spread over the country. And I remember a friend of mine, Gary Driggs, who's extremely strong, had to drop out. So here we had this hole in the trip. We needed another strong climber. And so we said, who can we get? And our first choice was Pete Schoening. And we got Pete. And the remarkable thing about Pete was, you know, it's difficult being a legend because you go with people and how do you live up to their expectations, right? I have to admit that on Hidden Peak, Pete Schoening exceeded our expectations. In fact, to me, he was the model of if you could have it. Extremely capable, extremely strong, very nice. When you couldn't keep up with him, he didn't give you this, what's wrong with you look. He'd say, oh, gee, I didn't know I was going that fast. And I can remember at the start of the trip at Kaufman, he and Pete and I and Andy went out to look at this route, which we eventually did. And we went up the glacier, and we're still not acclimatized. We go up, and I'm just collapsed in the snow from doing this, and Andy's sort of lying around. And Pete, the moment he hit, he's starting to chop out a tent platform. And I remember just sitting there sort of between breaths, hey, Pete, if you'll wait a minute, I'll help you with that. But the thing was also, he was extremely unassuming. And this is critically important in a way. Well, it's very important because you know how it is on a trip like that. Only a couple of climbers are going to reach the summit. They're the ones who are going to get, if they're whatever, all the publicity from it, okay? The rest of you don't exist, even though we all know it's a group effort. You need everybody working to get 2 people up. Pete is such a modest, nice guy that you would fall on your face carrying a load to put him in position to reach the summit. So that's why I say he's just ideal. People would say, what's your formula for success? And I'd say, oh, it's simple. You get permission, you get money, you get Schoening. Now that's Pete Schoening. And he just was a wonderful guy and the strongest physically. He wasn't probably the best, but he was an extremely good rock climber. But he was the strongest, unquestionably the strongest climber I have ever known. And in fact, we used to joke, you know, when you're young, you're sitting there, how can we finance trips? And we thought, I know what we'll do. We'll have a contest, a trail breaking in soft snow contest at 6,000 meters, and we'll enter Schoening, and we'll put bets on him, and then we'll clean up, and that'll finance us in the future. You know, our little stupid things. But that's Pete Schoening.
Who other American climbers you were close with?
Well, I was close with the ones on the expedition, especially, and I'm close. You're close with the ones you actually climb with. I mean, I was close to, I say Tom, Willie Unsoeld.
How was he, Willie Unsoeld? Because he had quite a reputation in Himalaya also.
Well, Willie was a character. I mean, we always kidded Willie because I occasionally I'd laugh at him and he'd start out and say, "Hey, Willie, you got to go out and work on your reputation." He'd laugh. Yeah. But he was a marvelous storyteller. I mean, he could just keep you.
Some of the stories he could narrate to you?
Well, it's hard for me to remember them all. I do remember one time, in those days, this is even before you had trays. you went in to give a talk and you had your slides in glass, or if you weren't otherwise, maybe not. And I can remember one time sitting there listening to Willie talk, and you could watch the slide melt on the screen. The projector, in those days, you knew you had to get that slide off the screen and go to the next one. Well, most of us talk on the pictures, but Willie just usually had the picture as a backdrop to telling some wild story. And so he'd be there telling this wild story, and there was his slide just melting on the screen. But, and the story I told about the padded shaft belay, that's not made up. That's classic Unsoeld.
What was that?
Okay, Willie is leading. This is on Washburn. You're up on the slope. It's not technically difficult. It's one of those things that you look at, it is dangerous, really dangerous, but it's not hard as such. And McGowan is one of the best ice climbers in the country. And as Willie tells the story, he forgot all the ice equipment is on McGowan, but Willie leads this thing out across this thing. And it's one of those things you're afraid any moment your step's going to break. And there's not going to be too much you can do about it because your ice axe just would go through a few inches of snow and slide on the ice underneath it. So Willie goes out the full length of the rope. In those days we used 100, I guess it was 120 feet. And he gets out there, it's a traverse, and he realizes he has got nothing to anchor. He doesn't have an ice screw. There he is, he's out there at the end of this thing, and you can't put your ice axe into this thing because it goes in a couple of inches and then slides. So what he did was, he put in a little lying up against the slope, and he packed snow around it. Then he puts the rope around the ice axe and then around himself, so they pull themselves into each other, and yells to McGowan to come on out. Look. So Dick, of course, was too far away to see this belay. So he comes traipsing out on this slope, and of course Dick is thinking, at any moment a step is going to break on me, but Unsoeld's got me on the rope. So he goes all the way out across this traverse with his heart in his mouth, and he gets it, and suddenly he sees what Willie has. He's standing there with an ice axe lying in the snow with a rope wrapped around it. And so he's McGowan's in semi-shock. And he says, Willie, that wouldn't hold a fall. So he said, Willie, what do you call that? That wouldn't hold a fall. And Willie says nonchalantly, oh, it's the padded shaft belay, Dick, referring to all the snow he's padded around the shaft. And it says it like, oh, it's standard technique 49, And McGowan looks at him and says, that's awful. That wouldn't hold a fall. And then he adds, why, even Pete Schoening wouldn't try a thing like that. And then Dick responds, and now both Willie and Dick guided in the summer. There was no full-time guiding in the United States, but on Rainier and in the Tetons, teachers and stuff had vacations, would go and guide tourists up these peaks. So Willie says, oh, I knew you wouldn't slip, Dick, and besides, I wouldn't do it except to a fellow professional. And so this is sort of an Unsoeld story. And the thing is, this wasn't made up after the fact. Most of us just get out there and go gulp and deal with the situation. You don't have a dialogue like this running back and forth on the rope. And
now Unsoeld was involved with Nanda Devi quite a lot.
That's right.
And he went first on this, let's say, what we call nuclear device expedition. What did he talk anything about that?
Well, I'm pretty sure Willie was not on that.
Not, okay. So then what did he say about his daughter?
Well, you see, what his story was that he had seen when he came over here in '49, and when this gentleman we met, Mr. Singh, here, they went up.
Which Mr. Singh?
The man that was who was the headmaster at Dehradun School.
Okay. Gurdial Singh.
Yeah, and apparently I'd heard, Willie had told me these stories about this trip in '49, coming over here on a shoestring with a friend and just going up here and, no money and what have you, and they had an Indian friend with him, and that turned out to be this man I met. And, and they saw Nanda Devi, the mountain, and Willie thought it was a beautiful mountain. If he had a daughter or something, he'd name it after him, which he did. Devi was born, and he named her named her Nanda Devi, and Devi Unsoeld. And in fact, Willie had names for his children which are close to regular names, like Devi's close to Debbie. And he had a son called Craig, which is close to Craig. So that's the story of his daughter. Willie had seen the mountain and talked about this beautiful goddess mountain, and so he named his daughter after him. And then, as you know, that expedition I guess it was probably 70s, I'm guessing 76,
yeah,
because
76.
because Ad Carter, 40th anniversary of the first ascent, and Ad Carter basically was putting it together, I believe. And and you know the story of the tragic story of,
yes.
of
But
that.
what was his sort of reactions to all this death of Nanda Devi, his grief or what?
He was very open. He was very open with his grief, and
I mean, did he ever felt guilty?
He never expressed guilt per se. He did not write out and such, but obviously it deeply affected him. And quite frankly, in my opinion, you can't be involved in an experience like that without feeling guilty, rightly or wrongly. As you know, there's this guilt feeling you have. It's not logical, of either a survivor's guilt, or I remember when I thought maybe we'd lost somebody on Washburn, and I thought, oh gee, and I'm the guy that put it together. So I mean, I think that's almost a given with almost everybody in a situation like that. Now, how it's expressed, or what they say, or how they behave may be all different, but in terms of, I don't think you can avoid it. I mean, I'm surprised if you can.
And he died rock climbing?
No, ironically, he died, Willie was always pushing the advantages of mountaineering and being in the mountains and so forth to younger people and so forth. And he was teaching at Evergreen College. He was one of the initial faculty there, which is more of a new college and oriented sort of toward the outdoors and ecology and environmental issues. And he was up on Mount Rainier with a class, and it got stormy, and he came down. It was it wasn't a regular route. He came down this route, and down near the bottom of an avalanche, a slide came down and sent them down the mountain. And Willie and several of the students were killed. Other students survived. And trying to put a positive note on it, they were able to be effective in helping each other because of the training they had. But he died, ironically, on an avalanche on Mount Rainier, which is right in his home territory. And
now, among the younger people of American climbing scene, whom do you sort of regard highest, or whom you have met? Other experiences?
Well, I really don't know too much of the latest younger scene, let's be honest. I knew the quote, who the younger people think are the old legends like Royal Robbins, Yvonne Chenard, Tom Frost. I knew all those people extremely well.
Okay, so then let's say, how were they? I mean, individually, could you say something about these three legends?
Well, Robbins was one of those, he started climbing at a time when, let's be honest, we all tried hard, but we didn't have the athletic people climbing. I mean, in the United States, if you were really athletic, you didn't go out for climbing. Now, we had some very good athletes, but what I'm saying is that climbing was not what they gravitated to. In fact, there was almost a stereotype. It was probably like England. But the Stanford Alpine Club had the highest grade average in the school. And when I went to the AAC, you see similar types, professional, what have you, but it was almost from the same layer. Now, Robbins was similar, but when he came along, the thing that was so amazing was his standard from the beginning, rock climbing, was far ahead of all the rest of us. I remember when he did his first climb in Yosemite, I wasn't there, but again, the climbing scene in California was very small. I mean, anything happened and you heard about it almost instantly. And he was from Southern California, I'm in Stanford, Palo Alto. And I heard about this guy. And what made him the start of a legend was there was one climb called the Higher Cathedral Spire. It was one of the first ones they did. And it came over the 30s, 40s, early 50s, sort of the test piece. There were a few harder climbs, but if you climbed the higher spire, you were really a rock climber. So it was that type of climb, you know what I mean. And the first pitch, real pitch, you're on this little ledge, and up to now you've been sort of coming up out of a gully and it's sheltered. Then you go up this corner and you get to where it gets extremely hard for us, and you traverse left around this corner, and then it looks blank, and you find yourself on a tiny ledge out over space because the thing has just dropped off over there. And then you go into a chimney and crack and climb up. And so the directions that they gave to him, which always worked with Royal's leading it, and I think it was Ray Van Aken or whoever it was, said, Royal, what you do is you go straight up, and when you can't climb any higher, you put in a piton and traverse around to the left. Fine. Now this has always worked. You know how this is. No trouble. Royal goes up, and Ray starts to talk to the number 3 guy on the rope, and they're not paying too much attention. And they look up, and there's Royal, and he's 20 feet above the traverse and still going because he could climb this. At this point, not everybody, most of us knew the higher spire. Most of us knew that pitch. And everybody just sort of took in their breath when they heard this story. And I can remember my initial reaction. This guy's either going to be the greatest rock climber in the country or dead. I mean, there's nothing in between with this guy. And interesting enough, to show how far ahead Royal was of everyone else, we had a grading system that started down at Tahkeetch Rock, which is in Southern California. And this rock, these climbs are all close together. And basically, because they're close together, you have a measurement. Well, this climb is this. This is the easiest. This is slightly harder. This is harder. They're all there. So you can measure the change in difficulty with examples. They're all on this rock. But in those days, there were 6 classes of climbing, taken from Europe with a twist. First class was a sidewalk. Second, a rougher. Third, you might want to use a rope occasionally. Fourth, use of a rope. 5, pitons for protection. 6, aid. Well, it wasn't quite true because sometimes the aid's easier than the 5th, but that worked. And if you asked a friend, I come to you, and you've done this climb, and I say, what's it like? You say, it's 5th class. And I said, is it easy, hard, or average? And you say, oh, it's probably average. And then our joke was, they say it's 4th class, which means you don't use pitons. You say, is it because it was easy or you couldn't stop to stick in a piton? But that's just a joke. But
Tom Frost, I mean, how much you knew him? Because he climbed Everest, and he was quite a famous man.
Frost?
Frost.
On Everest.
He did not go to Everest?
No, he didn't go to Everest. He was on Annapurna South Face.
Yes, South Face. Some Mary was there with Bonington, that's what I remember. Wasn't he?
Trying to think, who was with Bonington? Well, yes, he was at Annapurna South Face.
Annapurna South Face.
You're right, yes. Annapurna South Face.
Yes.
And he was with Bonington.
Yes.
That is absolutely correct.
Yeah.
I think he did because he helped make equipment and pitons like Chenard did. But a very pleasant guy, very strong, very, very capable, and very nice, very, very pleasant. Easygoing, very modest, and just the kind of guy you like to have on a trip and what have you. I will tell a story about both Chris and Tom on the Annapurna trip. I used to say in the old days, and I was president of the American Alpine Club, that the reputation of the president of the American Alpine Club depended on an event over which he had no control, which was the annual meeting and dinner. So naturally, with the club not doing much for people, their only contact with the club was going to this dinner and the talk and the thing. And if that ran well, obviously we have a very fine president. it makes no difference what else you've been doing all these years. And so my last dinner as president, it was the south face of Annapurna with Bonington and Tom Frost. And those two guys gave the most fantastic talk. You know, it was successful, it was hard, it was a tragedy, but the way they did it was just brilliant. So, I thanked them, but I just laughed because I always remembered that. Chris, you made my reputation. But,
Peter Chouinard?
Yvon Chouinard. Yvon was a character. You know, he had very little money, but he was a very good climber, and he made these pitons. Now, the first pitons he made were copies of pitons made by John Salathé. Now, you may be familiar with that or not. Salathé was sort of the pioneer climber after World War II. He did some very hard climbs. He was a real character. He was Swiss. He was a blacksmith. He was strong, and he was but he was very strong, and he made these special pitons, and they were the best pitons made. I had a few. He would sell a few to his friends, so I bought some, and that's what Yvon later used to make his lost arrows and what have you. But Chouinard, I kidded Yvon because the first time he and Frost and Robbins made a movie of climbing the west face of Sentinel, which is a hard climb. And my comment was, I watched him, I said, you know, Yvon, I can't climb like that. I can't put my right foot on my left shoulder and stand up on it. He laughed. He also made, I think, a remark I've always liked. This is when they're starting to pioneer the big walls. And so they have to spend the night. In those days, they didn't have special equipment. They just took hammocks up and strung them across. And he's giving a talk on, I think, the North American Wall or something. And he made the comment. He says, now, if you want to bivouac, you stick in 2 pitons. And he paused. And he said, but if you want to sleep, you stick in 6. And again, very cautious. He always had this, he would make this equipment, his ice axes and his hammers, and they're designed for function. And yet, the design was such they're works of art. In other words, he didn't design it to make them look good or anything, but as part of designing them to do their job, he turned out marvelous. And he was innovative. He was a pioneer in ice technique and ice climbing. And he never changed very much. He started from nothing until, I don't know, I mean, heaven knows how much. I mean, he's extremely wealthy. But his attitudes toward protecting the environment and things has never changed. And I have the highest respect for him because of the total things he's done, plus his climbing and what have you.
So who others were American climbers were your friends?
Oh gosh, there's just a whole...
Or did you meet anybody, Americans, or I'm sure you have, who were on Nanda Devi during those troubled nuclear power days?
Well...
And what did they say?
They didn't say anything to me. I mean, I figured out what was happening.
Was it known to, say, American climbing community that time?
No. And they never brought it up, I might add, in the AAC. The AAC had nothing to do with this. And so, no, they didn't. One person who had some experience with it was Jim McCarthy. And he had some interesting stories about it, but that was something that really wasn't out. It wasn't known or anything else. They pretty much kept their mouth shut. Yes.
And did you know Darren Firth?
Oh, which Norman?
Norman and Gio, both.
I didn't know Gio. He was before my time. Right. That was his father. I knew, of course, of him. But I knew Norman quite well. And I got to know him because it was after my trips he started Everest, working to put the Everest trip together. So I worked with him. You know, we discussed things a lot. And I knew Norman. I always admired, Norman got a lot, that trip was hard for Norman. Norman always got a lot of flack. But you know, Norman, I think, did the best job he could, and he was responsible for the whole thing. Also, I think one of the thing that caused Norman problems was, I think it sounds strange, I think he was more sort of an idealist. Now this sounds strange, because he thought he could put all these various things together and they'd be harmonious. And I think where his problem was instead of just getting climbers from various countries who were good climbers, for whether promotion reasons or what, he got the best climbers and best known climbers in each country. And the problem with that is that each one is concerned about what their own country is going to think of. I thought if you got climbers below that level and put them together, then you could avoid a lot of these problems, because they would mesh into a team which would help each other. So I think I'm not criticizing Norman for it. I'm sort of thinking it's because I think he was I'm not that idealistic in that sense. I believe firmly that climbers from everywhere can climb. It all depends on the individuals and their personality and their ability. But you've got to try and do it in a way that the whole thing blends, so everybody's agenda is the same. And I think Norm was a little naive in thinking he could do this and have everybody blend into a team. I'm not blaming him for it. I sort of admire him for trying it. Because his troubles came in those international expeditions. Yeah.
And James Whittaker?
Jim? Yeah, I knew Jim quite well. He was Jim was a nice guy, very strong.
Yeah.
I don't think he was probably the technical ability, say, of someone like Unsoeld or Hornbein, but a decent fellow, a little naive. I don't think he really realized what was going to hit him. And his first wife, pushed him a lot into this, and this wasn't quite his cup of tea. But I get along fine with Jim. He's a nice guy.
And he's starting of REI?
He didn't start REI. No, that was started in 1938 by the Andersons, Lloyd and Mary Anderson. And what it really was, again, not many climbers in the country. All the equipment's made in Europe. So they were figuring out a way to buy equipment in Germany, bring it over to the United States, and then sell it to each other. And the Andersons didn't want to make any money selling it, so they structured this little thing with everybody putting money in as a cooperative. And that's how it started, and basically ran out of the Andersons' garage or basement or wherever. And when I joined it 10 years later, 1948, I ordered some stuff after climbing the Grand Teton. The stuff came from the Andersons' house with a note from Mary Anderson. So that's how it got started. Now they opened their first store, and then they got the first employee to sort of mind the store, and then that was Jim. Jim was the first employee of REI, but he didn't. But this started at least about in the early 50s, when I think Jim was involved with it.
And I'm sure Ed Carter, you knew him very well.
I knew Ed very, very well.
How was he, and what were his other family, Jane Carter and others?
Well, actually, I don't think people realized how much Ann Carter worked with Ed to make the American Alpine Journal what it was. Ed was unreal. In fact, I realized him. I used to say that every president of the American Alpine Club had one prayer, which was, don't let anything happen to Ed Carter while I'm president. That was your nightmare. That was your big nightmare, because there's just no way. He's one of those people, you just can't replace him. And he was marvelous. I remember Ed was a skier. He was a very good skier. He skied in the 30s, among a very strong climber. And I remember I forget how it all got connected, but Bob Craig at Keystone, it was after some AAC event, we went up on Keystone, and we had Ed Carter and Yvonne Chenard and some other people and myself, and were all skiing, and Yvonne was really impressed with Ad, with his old technique and what have you, but he was really impressed with how Ad Carter could ski. I always got a chuckle out of that. But Ann was just a major part of the effort of putting it. But Ad was he was when it comes to putting out a journal and getting information, as you know, he was in a class by himself, and he had contacts absolutely all over the world. I mean, unreal. Nice guy.
Yeah. And among this, now, middle class, how is Mark Ritchie? Do you meet him often?
Oh, I don't meet him often anymore. For a while I did when he was president, but I don't meet him too often. I have the highest regard for Mark. I really like Mark, and his wife, Teresa. She is related, I can't forget that, her uncle or something was a good friend of mine, Cesar Morales in Peru, who was sort of the leading climber in Peru, or leading one in climbing down there from the 50s. I first met Cesar when I went down the Andes in 55, and he met us and was very friendly. It was interesting to meet his niece, married to Mark Ritchie. Small world. I mean, not just to the United States, but just, but most Mark and well, as you know, and Teresa are just wonderful people, and of course Mark's climbing is astonishing, and he was a very fine president of the American Alpine Club. He, working with Jim and Sarah, they were just marvelous. And
any other American climbers you would like to mention?
Well, the trouble is, Harish, there's so many, and I can't.
I mean, just a few. I mean, you know, and very quickly.
Oh.
Or some incident about them, meeting them, staying with you.
Well, American climbers. I think one of the most interesting characters I met, and I owe him a lot, was this John Salathé. Now, John was just totally out of the box with the other climbers in the Sierra Club. And he was a legend. His legend was that he and Axe Nelson made the first ascent of the Lost Arrow from the ground 5 days after they'd been attempted many times. There were 5 days on the Arrow. And he got to the top and he put in a whole row of expansion bolts up this thing. And people said he was just a, strong aid man, but he wasn't, because there was a first ascent he made down in Pinnacles, which is called the Hand. And this is volcanic rock, and the handholds tend to crumble and pull off. And he made a hair-raising lead up the final part of the climb. And in fact, the story was that he led this, he gets out, and he gets in one piton, and he starts going, and he's going above it, and pretty soon he's running out of rope, and there's no place to stop. So he says, tie in the second rope. So they tie in the second rope. Well, of course, that's not going to go through the piton, the carabiner. And the joke was the two friends, each wanted the other guy to belay because they were just sure John was going to fall and hit the ground, and neither one of them wanted to be the belayer for this thing. So John goes up, and he just reaches the top when that knot hits that piton and carabiner. And then the others come up, and then they take that out, and they put it in. And since then, the climb is still, they put in some more bolts to protect it after that. But I tell that story because people would, at that time, would say, well, oh, John, just all he can do is drive pitons. No, not true. But to show you, I remember I was, just a young climber, and I met him when he was camped in the campground. There was only 4 of us in that campground, sort of spring, there was snow on the ground. And he and Axe Nelson were there, and my friend John Mowat showed up, so they were very nice. And we did this climb together. But John, so on this climb, we split up, and Axe Nelson went with my friend, I went with John. That was sort of wild. I became a leader because he said, I never had led much at that point. My friends didn't think they could trust me, and they were probably right. I'm with John, and we scramble up this thing, and we come to this chimney. And he looks up at it, and he says, do you think we should use the rope here, Nick? And I'm going sort of, You try to act calm. Yes, John, I think we might want to use the rope. And the next thing that happens is, I said, would you like to lead it, Nick? I said, well, okay, John, I'll lead it. So I go on up, I get up about 40 feet, and it starts getting a little hard, so I put in a piton on this crux, and I get over it, and I keep going up, and what's happening is in Yosemite, the crack was starting to get wider and flaring, and I'm spreading out, and it's getting wider and wider, and I'm way up this thing, and I thought, gosh, this is a long pitch. I mean, I can't believe I'm this far up. And so here I am, I'm spread on this thing, feet on one side, back on the other, looking around to put in the piton, and I hear this tink, 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 clunk, 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 tink, 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 clunk, clunk, clunk. And what this means is that John, I've been off belay, John has climbed up 40 feet to that piton, and he's knocking it out, and we're both sitting at the crux, and I hear this voice saying, up rope, Nick. I said, just a minute, John. So I sort of fold myself, come down about 20 feet till I get into this crack and jammed in. And of course, meanwhile, the rope is just snaking past Salathé's feet. He's saying, what's wrong, Nick? Up rope, up rope. So I finally jammed in a belay position, flip the rope over me, pull it up. Okay, I got you, John, I'm belayed. And he comes up here, and he looks at me. And he sees me crammed in the crack. And he has a Swiss accent, which adds to all this. And he says, aren't you anchored, Nick? Now, I mean, anyone else, I'd start screaming, but I said, no, John. That isn't safe, Nick. You must always anchor. And he pounds in a piton behind me, and he ties me to it. And he goes on up, and what do I say? I can't say the great legend John Salathé. I'm just a beginner, relative beginner, for heaven's sakes. So he gets to the top, and finally, we get up. We were behind my friends because they went a different way, which is easier. And we get up, and Axe Nelson makes a remark to my friend John, says, now watch this. I heard that. I said, uh-oh. So we get up there, and I'm starving. And John has brought the food. So he reaches, because he's a vegetarian, all he ate was fruit and vegetables, so help me. He reaches into his pack, and he pulls out this apple and starts to split it, and you can see my face. He says, everything you need is in this apple, Nick. You know, and meanwhile, Axe Nelson and my friend are just practically rolling off the mountain. But it sort of turned me around because it gave me the confidence, and now I was leading, and then they made me a leader because what could they do? I was out of the box, but that was the legend, and he was just an absolute legend. He's a legend now, but he was an absolute legend in his time. We became very, very good.
And who are others? Your friends? Anybody you would like to recall?
Gosh, there are a lot of them. The one I did some of my best climbs with, well, there are two of them. Gary Driggs was a close friend of mine at school, and we'd done some short climbs. We got together, and every time we got together, the first one, these don't mean anything now, everybody romps up them, of course, but there were certain climbs that were symbols. And we did Snowpatch Spire, which only had 3 ascents, and one was by Fred Beckey, and 2 were, the first ascents were by people from Yosemite, and there was that Yosemite rock climbing background. And my friend Gary and I climbed it. And then we went from there to Devil's Tower on a roll, and we did that. And next spring with Bob Swift and Dick Irvin, we climbed the Lost Arrow, just rappelled down from into the notch and then up the pinnacle itself. So I kidded Gary. I said, we got to stop climbing together because every time we get together, we do something. And I did the North Ridge of the Grand Teton with him, and we didn't quite get up. We got over the hardest pitch, the Chalkstone pitch. We bivouacked for the night, and we could see the towns named after his grandfather, Driggs, Idaho, the lights going out one by one. It's this strange place to be watching the lights go out. But he was and he was one of these guys that was always positive. No matter how bad it was, he was always smiling. I mean, it could be totally miserable, and he would be projecting pleasure. And so that's, and there's so many others. I mean, did
you know anybody from American climb of K2?
The which one? Which?
The second one, you know, where they went and had a little controversy also. Forget that solicitor was the leader.
Who was the leader?
I think Whitaker.
Whitaker.
Yeah.
I knew a lot of them. I knew Galen Rowell and I knew Jim Wickwire. I think Wickwire was on it.
Yes.
And I knew a lot of them.
How was Galen Rowell? You had a close contact with him?
Yes, I even did one short climb with him. I knew Galen. I knew him before he became a photographer. He had a automobile mechanic shop. His father was a professor at the University of California in Berkeley. His mother was a well-known cellist. Not well-known, but she was a fine cellist. My wife plays the cello. She knew them. And Galen started off, he was a very good climber, of course, and he started off taking pictures. And, you know, one thing led to another, and he was a tremendous, brilliant photographer. But and I very fondly, it was a real tragedy when he and his wife were killed in that plane crash flying into Bishop. It was a real tragedy. Yes. And
now, can we talk about your work with the American Alpine Club? How did you join the club, and briefly, what your thoughts on the club?
Well, you know, I think one message for young people is you better be careful of what you do and say, because give it 30 years and you're going to be on the other end of it. I can remember before I joined the club, I was out in the Sierra Nevada section of the club, the Westerners, and I don't know, the Sierra Nevada section, you know, some things have a history that don't seem to change. 2, is extremely active and always a pain in the side of the main organization. The 2 seem to go along, the energy and the pain. And I can remember, I wouldn't even remember, but again, it was a small group. And Dick Leonard was just a legendary climber, pioneer rock climber. And I pioneer, I mean, he was there when Farquhar had Underhill come out and show him how to use pitons and modern technique in 31. And I remember Dick pounding the thing and about what's wrong with the American Alpine Club and the establishment and all this stuff and so forth. And we're all, you know, yeah. And so finally, after a year or so, I joined the club. And yeah, I joined it, and it was after Snow Patch. Also, very strange, Francis Farquhar would always have distinguished foreigners go through American Alpine Club meetings, and they always invited the young climbers. There weren't that many of us, so everybody's in this room. And I wanted to join, I guess, the Alpine Club of Canada first, because I wanted to use huts. But anyway, my friend introduced me to this man and said, very important, deputy chairman of the section. And I meet Mr. Coveney, and he says, my name is familiar. I'll spare the long details. Turns out he was my father's bunkmate in flight school in World War I. Now, if you can imagine how many people were in flight school and how many people were climbing in the United States, for those 2 to get to, and he hadn't seen my father since my father got married. So here I show up, on crutches, as a matter of fact. But he later came back east, and so I joined the American Alpine Club. Before that, I'd gone to the annual dinners, and I met these people. And they were famous to me. But what surprised me, they're all not nice, but suddenly they hit me that the American Alpine Club was like the Stanford Alpine Club 20 years later. There was just sort of a certain basic thing of these people, and you could see it. The other thing I learned is that we didn't think the club was doing anything. Well, the truth was there wasn't that much to be done. And the way we were structured, the club didn't want to impose on other clubs in the country. They were the active clubs. But if something had to be done, the club had the contacts to do it. And the way they operated was basically behind the scenes. Their problem was that they always avoided any publicity. So no one knew what they were doing. All you knew was poor Henry. Henry came out, very nice man. And he was the pillar of the club and supporting it and getting things done, and he was wonderful. But the poor guy had the habit, he was from Back Bay, Boston, and he didn't know it, but he stuck his foot in his mouth in full view of everyone. And I thought this was sad. This poor guy does this in public, and all of his good things are in private, and no one knows about it. And I got upset with him, and my friend Coveney said, Nick, that's just Henry. And later I learned what he meant about, and this image that you had. So I went back, and I'd go back to these dinners. And I think the main thing between me and a lot of other climbers in the West, except for a couple, was I actually went back to these dinners and got to know these Eastern people, and they knew me. And that's why I could get with Coveney there as secretary when I wanted to go to them. I got their support, they knew me. And so after Hidden Peak, I was put on the board, and I was from the West, and it was fascinating. And I realized, for instance, Royal Robbins had trouble in Yosemite. He stayed too long in Camp 4, and the Park Service was throwing him out. And this is back when no one stayed much at Camp 4, but Robbins was really staying there and doing a lot of climbing. I'll always remember, I got the story that Carl Fuller was president of the American Alpine Club at that time. And Carl just called up the director of the National Park Service, and we got the matter straightened out. Of course, you never saw that. It just got straightened out. And this is what wasn't seen. Instead, all they see is whatever old stuffy remarks are made or anything else. So they didn't see what was going on behind the scenes. And then what happens, of course, you get involved, and pretty soon you're involved. And I learned from this and other places that if you just do work, you're accepted. Because every organization, volunteer, needs people who will do work reasonably well. So if you do it, you're in. No matter what you may think of the in crowd, you can be in the in crowd if you're just willing to work. And so I got to know these people, and I always got along well with them. And because of some unfortunate things, like a friend of mine got killed, and these people had done a very good job of running the club. But they'd passed these, they'd all been the same committee, and they'd passed the jobs back and forth till they'd all done it. And suddenly, they needed someone else to do it. And the person who was logical was killed. That left him with me. So that's how I became president at the youngest age still.
In which year?
1968. I was 37, which is young for that. And I had the support of Carl Fuller and the old guard. That was important. I had their support. But I had another advantage, which I was from the West. I knew all the guys causing trouble, and they knew me. So I could go back, and I could come out and say things, and they would listen to me, because I wasn't part of the old guard. And we were able to get a lot of things done. I realized at that time that the most important asset the American Alpine Club had was the name, the American Alpine Club. So by using that and being, we are the national club, it's amazing what you could get done. Also, we only had one person who just sort of keeping the office. We had no staff. But what you do is if someone complained, the simple thing was, you don't like it? No. You want to do something about it? Yes. You're the head of the committee. We're forming a committee. You're in head. I'm backing you. Now go do it.